before it realizes it is standing in front of something valuable. The Saturday liquidation auction sat at the edge of town, behind a chain-link fence and a row of faded storage buildings. Most people came hoping to find cheap tools, spare parts, or old equipment they could resell. Mason Carter came for a different reason. He came because sometimes forgotten things still had stories left inside them. Beside him walked his 8-year-old daughter, Emily, holding a bottle of water and wearing a baseball cap that looked slightly too large for her. "Do you think we will find anything good?" she asked. Mason glanced across the crowded lot. "Maybe." That was all he said. It was usually all he needed to say. Near the back of the property sat a collection of abandoned vehicles covered in dust and years of neglect. Most bidders ignored them. The paint was faded. Several windows were cloudy. Tires looked worn. Nothing about them suggested value. Then Mason stopped walking. His eyes settled on one particular car hidden beneath a layer of dirt and old leaves. It looked ordinary at first glance, maybe even worse than ordinary. The auction tag hanging from the windshield listed a starting price of $100. Emily noticed her father staring. "That one?" she asked. Mason nodded slightly. "That one." 20 minutes later, the bidding began. Nobody showed much interest. A few people laughed when the auctioneer reached the old vehicle. Someone in the crowd joked that the scrap metal might be worth more than the car itself. The laughter grew louder when Mason raised his hand and offered $100. Standing nearby was Lauren Whitmore, owner of one of the most successful luxury dealerships in the state. She had attended the auction looking for inventory and happened to witness the moment. Her expensive sunglasses lowered slightly as she looked at the dusty car and then at Mason. "You are actually buying that?" she asked. Several people turned to watch. Mason simply nodded. Lauren smiled politely, though the amusement was obvious. "For $100, I guess everyone deserves a dream." A few people laughed. Others joined in. Mason did not react. He signed the paperwork, accepted the title, and quietly walked toward the vehicle. Emily climbed into the passenger seat and looked around the worn interior. "It smells old," she said. Mason almost smiled. "It is old." The engine barely started. The exhaust rattled. Dust floated through sunlight pouring across the cracked dashboard. Yet before driving away, Mason paused and rested his hand on the steering wheel. For just a second, his eyes settled on a small detail hidden beneath years of dirt near the instrument panel. Something most people would never notice. Something that made him look twice. Then he started the car and drove away, while the crowd continued laughing behind him. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes, and during most of it, the old car sounded like it was arguing with itself. Every bump produced a new rattle. Every stoplight introduced another strange vibration. Emily sat quietly watching the road ahead, while Mason listened to the machine. Not casually, carefully, as though every sound carried information. "Do you think it is worth $100? Emily finally asked. Mason kept his eyes on the road. "It was worth buying." Emily smiled. She had learned long ago that those answers usually meant more than they appeared to mean. When they reached their small house on the edge of town, Mason parked beside a detached garage that looked almost as old as the car itself. The building had once belonged to his grandfather. Years of repairs and improvements had kept it standing. Inside were shelves of tools, old photographs, and unfinished projects. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, just a place where things were fixed instead of discarded. As evening sunlight filtered through dusty windows, Mason opened the car door and began clearing away years of dirt from the dashboard. Emily handed him cleaning cloths while sitting on a nearby workbench. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Mason did not answer immediately. Instead, he carefully wiped a small section near the instrument panel. More dirt disappeared. Then more. Finally, a faint symbol emerged beneath the grime. Emily leaned forward. "What is that?" The mark was tiny. Most people would have missed it completely. Mason studied it for several seconds. "I am not sure yet." That was not entirely true. He had seen something similar years ago, a long time ago. The problem was that it should not have been there, not on a car like this. Meanwhile, across town, Lauren Whitmore sat inside her dealership office reviewing inventory reports. One of her sales managers mentioned the auction. "Did you see that guy buy the old junk car?" Lauren laughed softly. "The single father?" "That is the one." The manager smiled. "Probably spent more on the tow bill than the car." A few employees nearby laughed. Lauren returned to her paperwork. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds before everyone moved on. The car was already forgotten. Back in the garage, Mason continued cleaning. Beneath years of neglect, small details began appearing one by one. Unusual hardware, non-standard fasteners, tiny modifications that did not match the vehicle's original production specifications. None of them proved anything, yet together they formed a question. Emily watched her father grow quieter with each discovery. "You found something, did not you?" Mason rested a hand on the roof and looked at the symbol again. "Maybe." Outside, darkness settled over the neighborhood. Inside the garage, Mason opened an old storage cabinet and removed a worn reference book he had not touched in years. As he flipped through the pages, his expression remained calm. But when he finally found the section he was searching for, he stopped turning pages altogether. The symbol on the dashboard was there, exactly there. And according to the book, it should never have existed on a car worth $100. Sunday morning arrived with the smell of coffee, motor oil, and old paper. Mason sat alone in the garage before sunrise with the reference book open across his workbench. The small symbol from the dashboard stared back at him from a page that had yellowed with age. He read the paragraph beneath it again, then a third time. The information still felt difficult to believe. According to the book, the mark had been used only on a limited group of experimental vehicles connected to a legendary racing program decades earlier. Most collectors believed every one of those cars had already been accounted for. Some experts argued a few had disappeared entirely. Mason closed the book and looked toward the dusty car parked in the center of the garage. The problem was simple. A symbol alone proved nothing. Anyone could add a mark. Anyone could create a fake. Yet something about the vehicle continued to bother him. Not in a bad way, in a familiar way, like a puzzle missing one piece. A few hours later, Emily entered the garage carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in paper towels. "You forgot breakfast again," she said. Mason accepted one with a faint smile. "Thanks." Emily sat on a nearby stool and watched him examine the interior. "Did the book tell you something?" Mason nodded slightly. "Maybe." She laughed. "You always say maybe when you already know something." Mason almost smiled. Children noticed more than adults gave them credit for. Together, they spent the afternoon cleaning years of dust from hidden corners of the car. Under the seats, they found old receipts. Inside the trunk, they found weathered tools. Most items appeared ordinary. Then Emily noticed a loose section of interior trim near the passenger side. "What about that?" she asked. Mason carefully removed the panel. Behind it sat a small metal compartment that should not have existed. Both stared at it for a moment. Inside was a folded envelope protected by a waterproof sleeve. The paper looked decades old. Mason opened it carefully. A single document rested inside. The page contained handwritten notes, part numbers, and technical specifications. At the bottom appeared a signature. Mason froze. The name meant something, not to most people, but to anyone who understood racing history, it was impossible to ignore. Across town, Lauren Whitmore spent her afternoon hosting a luxury vehicle showcase at her dealership. Customers admired exotic sports cars, while sales teams discussed horsepower, rarity, and value. During a break between meetings, Lauren overheard two collectors discussing a famous missing race car connected to a legendary driver from the past. One of them mentioned that authentic examples would be worth millions if discovered today. Lauren listened briefly before returning to work. The conversation seemed interesting, but irrelevant. Meanwhile, back inside the garage, Mason placed the document beside the reference book and slowly looked from one to the other. The clues were beginning to connect. Not enough for certainty, not yet, but enough to make him realize that the crowd at the auction might have laughed at the wrong car. Monday morning found Mason standing beside the car with a flashlight in one hand and the old document in the other. Sunlight filtered through the garage windows while dust drifted slowly through the air. He had spent most of the night comparing part numbers from the hidden document against information in several reference books. The more he researched, the stranger the story became. Nothing matched the vehicle's public records. According to every official document, the car should have been completely ordinary. Yet piece after piece told a different story. Emily stepped into the garage carrying her backpack before school. "Did you solve the mystery?" she asked. Mason looked up from the engine compartment. "Not yet." Emily smiled. "That means you found another clue." Mason could not argue with that. He had. While cleaning deeper inside the engine bay, he had discovered a component that immediately caught his attention. Most people would never have noticed it. Even experienced mechanics might have overlooked it. The part looked simple, unremarkable, yet it should not have existed on a production vehicle from that era. He carefully removed years of grease and dirt from its surface. Beneath the grime appeared a small serial number. Mason wrote it down and carried it inside the house. An hour later, he sat at his kitchen table, searching through archived collector records. The serial number appeared only once. He checked again, then a third time. Same result. The component belonged to a highly specialized racing development program that had existed for less than 2 years. Fewer than a dozen examples were ever documented. Mason leaned back in his chair. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier. Across town, Lauren Whitmore's dealership continued attracting collectors and enthusiasts. Word had begun circulating about an upcoming charity automotive event scheduled for the end of the week. Several respected collectors planned to attend. Industry publications were covering it. Lauren hoped the event would bring valuable attention to her business. During a meeting, one of her staff mentioned a rumor spreading through local collector circles. Someone claims they found unusual racing components inside an old auction car. Lauren barely looked up from her paperwork. Collectors always have rumors. The conversation ended there. Meanwhile, Mason returned to the garage after dropping Emily at school. He removed another panel from the vehicle and discovered something even stranger. Hidden behind years of modifications sat a small metal plate secured deep inside the chassis. The plate carried manufacturing information. Most of it had become difficult to read, but one section remained perfectly visible. Mason stared at the engraving for a long moment. Then he walked to the workbench and compared it to the document from the hidden compartment. The numbers matched. Not approximately, exactly. For the first time since buying the car, certainty began replacing curiosity. He still did not know the entire story, but he now knew one thing beyond doubt. The car sitting in his garage was not the car everyone believed it was, and somewhere in its history, someone had worked very hard to hide that truth. By Tuesday afternoon, Mason knew enough to become careful. Not excited, not reckless. Careful. The clues were beginning to point somewhere significant, and years of experience had taught him that assumptions often ruined good discoveries. Instead of announcing anything, he decided to let other people look at the evidence. He photographed the unusual component. He documented the serial numbers. He scanned the handwritten document from the hidden compartment. Then he contacted 3 respected collectors whose opinions carried weight within the automotive community. None of them knew each other. None knew what the others would see. Mason simply sent the information and waited. The first response arrived less than an hour later. The collector thanked him politely but dismissed the findings. According to him, unusual parts appeared in old vehicles all the time. The second expert was even more skeptical. He suggested the car had probably been modified decades earlier by hobbyists. The third response arrived near sunset. It was only 2 sentences long. Interesting parts, unlikely to be authentic. Mason was not surprised. In fact, he expected exactly that reaction. Experts often trusted records more than anomalies. The problem was that the records surrounding this car were already beginning to contradict themselves. Later that evening, Emily sat beside him at the kitchen table while he reviewed notes. "What did they say?" she asked. Mason looked up from his paperwork. "Most think it is nothing special." Emily considered that for a moment. "Do you?" Mason folded one page and placed it aside. "I think they are missing something." Emily smiled. "You usually find things people miss." Then she returned to her homework as though she had stated the most obvious fact in the world. Across town, Lauren Whitmore attended a networking dinner connected to the charity automotive event scheduled later that week. Collectors, investors, and dealership owners filled the room. During a conversation near the bar, someone mentioned rumors about an old auction car generating discussion online. A collector laughed. "Every week someone thinks they found a lost treasure." Several people smiled and nodded. Lauren remembered the single father from the auction and the dusty vehicle he had purchased. "Let me guess," she said. "Another miracle discovery." The table laughed. The topic disappeared almost immediately. Meanwhile, back in the garage, Mason continued examining the car. While tracing an old wiring route beneath the dashboard, he discovered something hidden behind a panel he had not removed before. It was not a major component, not a valuable part, just a small metal tag attached deep inside the structure. Yet the moment he saw it, he stopped moving altogether. The tag carried a manufacturing code, one he recognized from the reference book, one that should have existed only on vehicles connected to the same legendary racing program as the symbol and the special component. Mason stared at it quietly. Another clue. Another impossible coincidence. And the more impossible coincidences he found, the harder it became to believe they were coincidences at all. Wednesday morning brought the answer Mason had been searching for. It arrived through a phone call from an automotive historian whose work was respected throughout the collector community. The man had received Mason's photographs the previous evening and spent most of the night reviewing archived records. His voice sounded calm, but there was something unusual beneath it. Curiosity. "Where exactly did you find this vehicle?" he asked. Mason looked through the garage window toward the car. "An auction." Several seconds passed. "That may be one of the strangest sentences I have heard this year." Mason remained silent. The historian continued. I cannot confirm anything yet, but the manufacturing code, the internal tag, the development component, and the document you found all point toward the same possibility. Which is? Another pause. There was a prototype racing program that disappeared from public records decades ago. Most people assumed the vehicles were destroyed, converted, or hidden in private collections. Mason glanced toward the workbench. And this one? If it is authentic, it should not exist. After the call ended, Mason sat quietly for several minutes. Not because he was excited, because he understood the difference between evidence and certainty. He still needed more proof, much more. Emily found him later that afternoon studying old photographs on his laptop. "Did you find another clue?" she asked. Mason smiled faintly. "Maybe the biggest one yet." Emily climbed onto a chair beside him. On the screen sat a black and white photograph taken many years earlier. Several mechanics stood around a race car inside a workshop. Most faces were impossible to identify, but one detail immediately stood out. A small marking near the dashboard. The same symbol hidden beneath decades of dirt inside Mason's car. Emily pointed at it instantly. "That is the same thing." Mason nodded. "It is." Across town, the charity automotive event was beginning to attract attention. Collectors from several states planned to attend. Industry reporters had started publishing previews. Lauren Whitmore's dealership stood at the center of the preparations. During a meeting, one of her staff members entered carrying a tablet. "You should see this." Lauren glanced at the screen. Several automotive forums were discussing unusual photographs recently shared by a local enthusiast. The images showed obscure racing components, manufacturing tags, and historical markings. Nobody knew where the vehicle was located. The comments ranged from skepticism to fascination. Lauren looked at the photos for only a few moments before her expression changed slightly. Something felt familiar. Then she recognized it. The dusty auction car. The same one purchased by the single father she had laughed at days earlier. "That cannot be the same vehicle," one employee said. Lauren stared at the screen a little longer. Probably not. Yet for some reason, she no longer sounded completely certain. Back in the garage, Mason discovered one final piece of evidence hidden inside an old maintenance binder stored beneath the rear seat. A faded inspection record carried a handwritten name. The moment he read it, he stopped breathing for a second. The signature belonged to one of the most legendary figures in racing history. And suddenly, the impossible story was becoming very real. Thursday afternoon, the garage door was open when the visitor arrived. Mason heard the sound of a vehicle stopping outside long before he looked up from the workbench. Emily was sitting nearby working on a school project while the old car rested beneath bright overhead lights. The visitor stepped out slowly. He was older now, gray-haired, calm, the kind of person who carried authority without ever needing to announce it. Mason recognized him immediately. Almost every serious racing fan in America would have recognized him. Daniel Cross, a racing legend whose name still appeared in documentaries, museums, and championship records. Emily looked toward the driveway. "Do you know him?" Mason nodded once. "Everybody does." Daniel walked into the garage and stopped several feet from the car. He said nothing at first. His eyes moved slowly across the bodywork, the dashboard, the engine compartment, and finally the small details Mason had uncovered during the past few days. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Then Daniel smiled very slightly. "I wondered if one of these still existed." Mason leaned against the workbench. "You have seen one before?" Daniel nodded. "Not one. All of them." Emily lowered her pencil. Even she understood that the conversation had suddenly become important. Daniel moved closer and carefully examined the hidden manufacturing tag. Then he looked at the handwritten inspection record Mason had discovered beneath the rear seat. His expression softened. "I remember this document." Mason raised an eyebrow. "You do?" Daniel nodded again. "Because I signed it." The garage became completely quiet. Emily looked from one man to the other. Mason simply listened. Daniel rested a hand on the roof of the car. This was part of an experimental racing project decades ago. Most people never knew it existed. A few prototypes were built. Then the program disappeared. He glanced toward the dashboard. "We believed every surviving example had been located years ago." Mason folded his arms. "Apparently not." Daniel laughed softly. "Apparently not." Across town, Lauren Whitmore was preparing for the charity automotive event when her phone began receiving notifications. Collectors were sharing photographs online. Rumors were spreading faster than before. One image showed Daniel Cross standing inside a small garage beside a dusty old car. Another showed the rare symbol hidden on the dashboard. Lauren stared at the screen. The room around her seemed to fade into the background. The auction, the laughter, the single father, the $100 purchase. Suddenly, every detail returned. Back in the garage, Daniel continued examining the vehicle. Finally, he stepped back and looked directly at Mason. "I have spent years searching for missing pieces of racing history." He glanced once more at the car. Then he smiled. "And I think you may have just found one of the most important pieces of all." By Friday morning, the story had spread far beyond the local collector community. Automotive forums, enthusiast groups, and industry publications were all discussing the same discovery. Photographs of the dusty auction car appeared everywhere. Experts who had dismissed the evidence earlier were suddenly reviewing every image again. Collectors who had ignored Mason's messages were now calling back. Some apologized. Others asked questions. Most simply wanted to know if the rumors were true. Mason spent very little time responding. Instead, he stood quietly in the garage while Daniel Cross completed a final examination of the vehicle. Emily sat nearby reading a book, occasionally looking up whenever she heard something interesting. Daniel carefully reviewed the manufacturing codes, historical documents, and development components one final time. Then he stepped back and folded his arms. The silence lasted several seconds. "It is authentic," he said. Mason nodded once. He had expected that answer. Hearing it still felt different. Emily lowered her book. "Authentic means real, right?" Daniel smiled. "Very real." News of the confirmation traveled quickly. By early afternoon, several collectors had already contacted Mason with offers. Some numbers sounded impressive. Others sounded absurd. Mason listened politely and declined every one. Not because he was negotiating, because he wanted to understand the story before making a decision. Meanwhile, preparations continued at Lauren Whitmore's dealership for the charity automotive event scheduled that evening. Attendance was expected to be the largest in the event's history. Collectors, investors, journalists, and industry personalities filled the guest list. Yet despite all the luxury vehicles on display, conversations kept returning to the same topic: the mysterious auction car. Lauren heard the story repeated so many times that she eventually stopped correcting people. The facts were already speaking for themselves. Late that afternoon, a black sedan arrived outside Mason's house. Daniel Cross stepped out carrying a folder. Emily opened the front door before Mason could reach it. "You are back," she said. Daniel smiled. "I told you I would be." They gathered inside the garage beside the car. Daniel opened the folder and removed several authenticated records from private archives. Historical photographs, ownership references, racing documentation. Every piece confirmed the same conclusion. The vehicle was one of the long-lost prototypes connected to one of the most influential racing development programs in American motorsport history. Daniel looked at the car for a long moment. Then he turned toward Mason. "I have spent decades around race cars," he said quietly. "Very few deserve to be called irreplaceable. This is one of them." Mason remained silent. Daniel reached into the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. "I came here because I do not want it disappearing into another private collection." He handed the document to Mason. The garage became completely still. Mason glanced down at the number printed on the page. Emily looked at him curiously. Even she could tell something important had just happened. Daniel smiled faintly. "That is my offer." And for the first time since buying the car for $100, Mason found himself genuinely surprised. Mason looked at the document again. $5 million. The number remained exactly the same no matter how many times he read it. Across the garage, the old car sat beneath the lights looking no different than it had a week earlier, when people laughed at it. Emily studied her father carefully. "Is that a big number?" she asked. Daniel Cross smiled. "Very big." Mason set the paper down and looked back at the car. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he asked the only question that seemed important. "If I sell it, what happens to it?" Daniel's answer came immediately. "It gets restored, documented, and preserved. People get to see a piece of racing history instead of hearing stories about it." Mason nodded slowly. That mattered to him. The car was valuable. The story behind it was priceless. Later that evening, they completed the agreement. There were no dramatic celebrations, no shouting, no victory speech, just signatures, handshakes, and mutual respect. By the following day, news of the sale had spread across the automotive world. Reporters wrote articles, collectors discussed the discovery. Experts who once dismissed the car now called it one of the most remarkable finds in recent memory. Meanwhile, the charity automotive event was underway. Lauren Whitmore stood near the entrance greeting guests when she noticed a familiar truck entering the parking area. Mason stepped out first. Emily followed beside him. Conversations gradually quieted as people recognized him. Lauren walked toward them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she offered a small smile. "I owe you an apology." Mason looked at her calmly. "For what?" Lauren laughed softly. "You know exactly for what." Several people nearby listened without pretending otherwise. Lauren shook her hand. "I looked at that car and saw scrap metal." Her eyes moved toward Mason. "You looked at it and saw something everyone else missed." Mason shrugged slightly. "I got lucky." Daniel Cross, standing nearby, overheard the comment and smiled. "No," he said. "You paid attention." The crowd became quiet again. Lauren nodded. "That too." Emily looked up at her father. "Can we fix the roof now?" The question caught everyone off guard. A few people laughed gently. Mason smiled for the first time all day. "Yeah," he said. "I think we can fix the roof." As the event continued around them, reporters chased stories, collectors discussed history, and industry leaders talked about the discovery that had surprised them all. Yet Mason's attention remained on his daughter. The money would help, the recognition was nice. But neither was the real reward. The real reward was standing beside the person who had believed in him before anyone else did. Together they walked toward the exit while conversations continued behind them. This time, nobody was laughing. They were watching. And finally, they understood the value that had been there all along.